Welcome. I'm Dina Mansour, Executive Director of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center at the University of Montana. And thank you for joining us today on this Mansfield First Take on Venezuela. The Mansfield Center was founded by an act of Congress in 1983 to support the community on issues of ethics and public affairs, as well as international engagement. And I think we'll hear throughout this conversation today how this conversation supports our dual mission. We are honored to welcome Owen Sears today to be our speaker. I'll share a bit of his bio with you in a moment. He will present for a bit, but then we really want this to be an active conversation. So please do pose your questions in the Q&A box. So we have disabled the chat box, and I encourage you to funnel your questions to the Q&A box, and he will take those at the end of his presentation. We have just about an hour today, so we'll get to it. Owen is a faculty member here at the Mansfield Defense Critical Language and Culture Program. He is a former intelligence analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency in Washington, D.C. He's also lived in the region that we're discussing today, including Costa Rica and Mexico, and is currently researching a book on Cuban intelligence. Owen, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dina, for that kind introduction. And good morning, good afternoon, according to your time zone out there, wherever you are. Welcome today to our discussion on Venezuela and the implications of the most recent U.S. military operation there. So I'm going to proceed right away. And as you're going to see, we'll go through several slides and then open it up for discussion. So what do we know so far? Short answer is not a whole heck of a lot. We do know that tactically, military parlance, it was a successful U.S. Army Delta Force and Special Operations Aviation Regiment mission. The SOAR are the guys and gals who fly the helicopters at night in very complex and difficult operations. Delta Force, well, it's not supposed to be identified as such, but I think if you've opened up the New York Times in the last couple of days, you've seen multiple references to a unit that has no name. The mission seized the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, and his spouse in an operation that resulted in no U.S. fatalities, although there were several wounded, and anywhere up to 70 or 80 Venezuelans and Cubans, interestingly enough, who were killed. We do know also that there was CIA assistance. There have been all kinds of reports that have been leaked to the press, I think quite deliberately by CIA, talking about how, hey, we were on the ground before anybody else, and we had an access agent, or asset rather, who was very close to the president. Maybe that person won the $50 million reward. I guess time will tell. I think a key White House decision that was made was that there'd be no regime change. That has had a lot of us outside the White House scratching our heads and going, okay, why not? There have been no U.S. boots on the ground, at least for now. The existing Venezuelan government, the government created by Hugo Chavez in the late 1990s and perpetuated by his heir, Nicolas Maduro, has been preserved. This is not a regime change operation. And according to the U.S. President Donald Trump, the U.S. is to control Venezuela's oil resources. That's it. All right. I could close the book now and say that's pretty much where we're at, although that's not going to be very satisfying, I think, to my audience. What are the implications then? Here's where we get a little away from the facts, although not entirely, and look at some of the analysis. Look, at bottom, one dictator was removed, Nicolas Maduro. I don't think there are going to be too many people crying tears for this guy, all right? Even if you're only a casual observer of the press, you'll know that Nicolas Maduro has been up to his neck in all kinds of human rights abuses, not to mention being a key figure in narcotics trafficking. So he's been removed only to be replaced by another regime figure, a woman named Delcy Rodriguez. New York Times did a great article on Delcy Rodriguez's background. I won't go into it here unless it's in the Q&A session. She's a regime figure, all right? Clear and cut, no questions about that. She was the vice president under Maduro. She's been named, I guess, acting president. I think what's most important, though, and here's where we, verge away into more of an analytical side, is that two key regime strongmen are still in power. Vladimir Padrino, who is the defense minister, he controls the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, La Guardia Nacional, the National Guard. He's still in power. Diosdado Cabello, who is the Interior Minister, who's also responsible for the intelligence services, the political police, he's still in power. These are the two guys you should be looking at. I'm not taking too much away from Delcy Rodriguez other than to suggest that although she's president somewhat in name, these are the two you need to keep a closer eye on. The future of the opposition in Venezuela is unclear. This is where I've been scratching my head and trying to figure out, all right, why not? What the heck is going on here? Maria Corina Conchado was the leading opposition figure in Venezuela in the 2024 elections. She was not allowed to run in those elections because the regime basically said, you're too popular. They didn't say that, but that's what it meant. You're not allowed to run. She won the Nobel Peace Prize. So obviously a key figure in the opposition movement. Her front man, in other words, the person who ran in her place, was a retired Venezuelan diplomat named Edmundo Gonzalez. Edmundo Gonzalez's ticket won over 60% of the vote in the 2024 elections. Now, the regime doesn't admit this, but then again, the regime is its own worst enemy. They were using election machines, the results of which were printed out and then thrown in the trash. And all the opposition did was go around to all the trash cans in all the election districts in Venezuela, take out the results and say, actually, we won over 65% of the vote. And the regime said, no, you didn't, and really did a really terrible job of rigging an election. I mean, it was so bold and baldly false. But nonetheless, the winners of the 2024 elections were not installed in power and right now don't seem anywhere close to power. Donald Trump has called Conchado a figure who's not respected in the Venezuelan political establishment. So I'm not quite sure what that means, other than things don't look good for her unless she meets with him, as apparently is going to take place. All right, so one thing that the U.S. president did stress was that the operation was intended for U.S. control of Venezuela's oil. There's no pussyfooting around about this. There's no pretense here that this was because of human rights abuses of the regime or to bring democracy. His messaging has been pretty consistent. Now, his energy secretary added in a press conference that the U.S. intends to control Venezuelan oil, quote unquote, indefinitely, which, hey, that's a big word. That could mean indefinite U.S. control of Venezuela's number one resource. Messaging from the White House has been pretty consistent that this control by the U.S. of Venezuela's number one natural resource is supposed to bring benefits not only for Venezuelans, but also for Americans, although it's not quite clear how either population at the moment is going to benefit. One thing that does seem to be clear, because the Venezuelan government really hasn't denied it, but the administration in the U.S. has insisted on it, is that Venezuela is automatically going to give us $50 to $60 million barrels of oil, automatically. I guess that's the price for our operation. Now, one thing that we do need to know, and is a fact, is that decades of regime corruption and mismanagement in Venezuela have utterly destroyed the oil industry. According to The Economist, which is a British news magazine, Venezuelan oil production in 2024 fell to its lowest level since the 1940s. Now, that's not because of sanctions, okay? Everybody makes a big deal of US sanctions on Venezuela being the number one cause of the collapse of the oil industry, but that's patently false. Venezuela pumps as much oil as it possibly can, and most of it goes to China to pay off debts. So if Venezuela could pump more, it would, but it can't. Now, according to some estimates, and I'm only quoting press reports here, the Venezuelan oil industry is going to require anywhere up to $100 billion in investments, recapitalization of the stock, in order to make it productive again. I mean, it's at 800,000 barrels, down from about 3.5 million barrels per day. So there's a long way to go. And the money alone isn't going to be the thing. I mean, that's the main part, but it's time and security and stability. So Donald Trump, the US president, called US oil companies to the White House last Friday, I think in an attempt to both convince and strong arm them into investing. I say strong arm because that's coming out of some of the press reporting about the meeting, specifically concerning Chevron, which is the one company that still has a substantial investment in Venezuela. But let's be blunt, at $60 per barrel, which is quite low in the oil market these days, American oil companies simply aren't interested in having more oil on the international market. More oil means the prices go down. And so they have a natural market interest in not increasing the supply at this time, especially when the prices are as low as they are. One Exxon Mobil executive said, we've been robbed twice in Venezuela over the last 50 years when our assets have been nationalized. Why the heck are we going to do it now? And that's coming straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So I'm not sure if the oil argument is going to be a very valid one over the long term. One thing that doesn't get mentioned a lot in the press, but I think should be highlighted, if only because it's going to matter, is this simple question: do Venezuelans get a say in things? Do they get a say in who runs their country? Apparently not at the moment, not for now. Although indefinitely control of their oil resource is something that I think very few of them would agree to. Do they get a say in how their countries run? Well, they voted in 2024 in overwhelming numbers for an opposition candidate who apparently is not going to be put in charge of the country. Are they going to get a say in bringing their oppressors to justice? Thousands have been put in prison. God knows how many have been killed and tortured in prison. Is there going to be any sort of reconciliation with the past? At the moment, I doubt it. Are they going to have a say in how their oil resources are apportioned? Doesn't look like it, based on the statements by the U.S. Energy Secretary. What will be the nature and extent of American control over Venezuela? I mean, I think this is the big question that we as Americans should be asking ourselves, regardless of our political inclinations. As a rule, the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico aside, we're not historically been in the business of direct colonial control over countries. So what does this mean? And I don't see a national debate being created right now over this key question for us, let alone for Venezuelans. These questions apparently don't bother the US government. And by US government, I'm painting a broad brush here over the executive and the legislative, frankly. To be blunt, rather disappointed in the lack of serious discussion about this in Congress at the moment. But I think all of these questions could come back to haunt us. All right. We know this instinctively. You wouldn't be listening to me today if you didn't realize why these questions are important. They are. It's a fact Venezuela currently has the largest proven oil reserves in the world. A lot of people don't know that. They think Saudi Arabia, or even ourselves, or possibly Russia. But no, it's Venezuela. I'm not an oil expert, so you'll have to forgive me. Um, but apparently, Mexican oil or Venezuelan oil is like Mexican oil, it has a high sulfur content. It's more expensive to refine into gasoline and other products. But that being said, we have a refining industry in this country, especially in Texas and Louisiana, that has been specifically geared towards refining this kind of oil. So if you're in this business, there is a logical fit here. But like I said, the problem is not on our end. The problem is on their end. Oil infrastructure in Venezuela is all but ruined. And by the way, all the people who were trained to operate this equipment were laid off by either Chavez or Maduro during their various crackdowns and nationalizations of the industry. So you can build infrastructure, but you got to train labor to operate that infrastructure, and that's going to take time. Here are some more awkward questions to raise. How long will U.S. control Venezuela's oil? Indefinitely, says the Energy Secretary. Our politics don't work that way, frankly. Um, and I don't think this is politically viable. I'm answering my own question. You're welcome to object. Will Caracas strongmen acquiesce to U.S. bullying? You might say they already are, except that Delcy Rodriguez, Diosdado Cabello, Vladimir Padrino, they've all come out, down with Yankee imperialism, and done the whole propaganda shtick. Does that mean that behind the scenes they're saying, we just had to say that? Well, if that is the case, then they are truly cynical. And how long is that going to last, right? This is not a recipe for long term stability. These guys and gals have a lifetime of anti US politics. Two of the three, Padrino Lopez and Delcy Rodriguez, have a lifetime of participation in Communist Party politics in Venezuela. These are not the people who are just going to, you know, they'll take the paycheck with the bribe, pocket it. But I have a feeling that our control over them is probably not as assured as we think it is. Um, how will Venezuela's oil profits be shared? Well, that's fair enough, except that the administration has already said that Americans will benefit, which, in addition to 50 to 60 million barrels of oil, suggests to me that future profits, whatever profits will be made and when they'll start accruing, are going to enter our pockets, right? I guess via tax breaks. I don't know. I mean, and what about Venezuelans? They've got a country to rebuild. And who's going to get left out of the giant piñata that is the Venezuelan oil industry? Do you think the military are going to say, all right, boy, we got humbled by the Americans. I guess we're going to lose our share of the oil profits that came through the black market? I don't think that's going to go down very well. What about Venezuela's debts to China and Russia? It's all very well for us to go, they're done. This hemisphere is ours. We're shutting them out. Except that Venezuela still owes China about $10 billion worth of oil. They've been paying down. They've been paying down their debts through oil exports to China. I don't think China's just going to say, "Well, we forgive the debts and let it go away." Um, Will Venezuelans acquiesce to preserving the dictatorship? If that indeed is the American intention, kind of a cynical deal where Rodriguez and Lopez and Cabello are allowed to stay in power and take all the criticism and the blame while we pocket the proceeds, I don't think this is going to last long. There will be mass protests. And the question that we should be asking ourselves is what will the U.S. do then? Are we going to acquiesce to the crackdowns on citizens? Or are we going to criticize, which means we're criticizing the people who are fronting for us in a cynical power sharing deal with a dictatorship that we have, whether you're Republican or Democrat, have consistently denounced for decades? This is going to put us in an awkward position, right? It's worth bearing in mind a saying attributed to Simon Bolivar, the founder of Venezuela, the fount of all propaganda from the Chavez and Maduro regime, although I think Bolivar's words have been abused. But he did have one good thing that should be borne in mind, both in Venezuela's military establishment as well as our own. He said, "Damned is the soldier who points his arm against his people." Um, you know, is this what we're ultimately going to require to keep our deal with the regime we've left in place there? I mean, they already have pointed their gun at their own people, but now we're kind of guilty by association with it, aren't we? All right, there are implications for the hemisphere. The president has announced a Dunroe Doctrine, which is his pun on the Monroe Doctrine, which essentially greenlights more of our intervention in the Western Hemisphere. I'll show you the literal words in a minute, so you'll see that I'm not being, misusing words. For Latin Americans, and frankly for Canadians as well, this revives some old unpleasant memories in U.S. foreign policy, lest we get too high on our horse and say we have no colonial history. Of course, forgetting the Philippines, forgetting Puerto Rico, among other things. It revives old unpleasant memories of gunboat diplomacy, right? I know now it's kind of chic to say, well, we should have a muscular foreign policy like Theodore Roosevelt and the Great White Fleet. Or the flip side of it is the infamous imperialismo Yankee. I don't need to translate that for you, which has been the mantra of generations upon generations of Latin American politicians and intellectuals. Of course, the regional states fear the loss of sovereignty. If the United States can go in and snatch the leader of one country, what's to stop the United States from going in and snatching the president of Mexico, for example, or the president of Nicaragua? Or if I'm the Cuban leader right now, Diaz-Canel, I would be kind of worried too, right? I mean, something has happened here. It evokes a memory of U.S. policy in the region that, yeah, you can go back to the 80s, maybe with the Contras in Nicaragua, or you can go back further than that, U.S. Marine deployments in the Caribbean. I would not want to be a U.S. diplomat right now. That's all I'm saying. Talk about a thankless job. Going to the foreign ministry in Brasilia, say, and saying, well, this is what we really hope to accomplish in Venezuela. And the foreign minister is smiling and nodding and saying, yeah, I know why you're there. It's oil. Your own president said so. Now, we do have our sights on Cuba. Remember that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, has never let Cuba fall too far off the scope, even if most of the Trump administration really doesn't give a damn about the island. Rubio is a Cuban American, and he's made it very clear that the end of that regime, the former Castro regime, now with a very colorless air, should be gone too. And remember, and again, the administration hasn't let us forget about it. Venezuelan oil has helped keep the Cuban economy afloat for years after the Soviet Union, Cuba's former patron, disappeared. All right, so the Dunroe Doctrine. I took just one quote from the White House's National Security Strategy document, a rather frightening document from my standpoint because of its implications. There's a lot here, and we can't just mistake it for rhetoric. So here is what the president calls his corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. We will deny non-hemispheric competitors, read China, read Russia, the ability to position forces or other threatening capabilities or to own or control strategically vital assets in our hemisphere. Um, you know, the military part, I think we can all kind of understand, although that didn't stop Nikita Khrushchev from putting missiles in Cuba or the Soviets building a submarine base in Havana. But anyway, let's let that be bygones. Strategically vital in assets. So Venezuelan oil, Panama Canal. I mean, we can start going down the list. This is interesting only in so much as it's American attention on Latin America for the first time, maybe since the Reagan 1980s in Nicaragua. But this is not the kind of attention I would argue that the vast majority of Latin Americans necessarily want. And then comes Greenland. And the focus on Greenland has me personally baffled. Um, this is not Monty Python, right? I mean, you can almost see the skit in the British dry humor. Greenland. We've got to have Greenland. That is what we're going to fall on our swords over. I get it. There's a strategic location here, and the Arctic is becoming more important. Although the flip side of the same argument is, why aren't we doing more in Alaska, which is just as important and just as Arctic? Why aren't we building more icebreakers? We've got like 2 compared to 20 for Russia. Um, so the strategic location argument, maybe, although the Danes have already told us, they're the colonial owners of Greenland, have already told us you can put as much there as you want in your base there. Natural resources. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I mean, has anyone really gone in there and said they've got this, this, and that? And this, and that, can we not find them in other countries where it's a little more economical to actually exploit those resources? Yeah, prestige. That's the one I get, maybe inherently more than the others. The president has made Greenland a fixation since his first term, and he's returned to it in his second term. And it's almost like in his mind, it's unfinished business from term one, and I'm going to make it clear in my second term that I'm going to do it. And we've seen doubling down. As Europe has tried to gather a bit of backbone and said, well, we don't think that's such a good idea, we see the president saying, by peace or by war, right? And yeah, that may be a bargaining tactic. And yeah, this is the art of the deal. Although threatening war with an ally, frankly, has me baffled. Again, it's not just Greenland, but it's threatening a NATO ally, which, by the way, while we're here talking about this, has been a pretty faithful ally of the United States for well over a quarter century. They went into Afghanistan. They had the first or second highest casualty rate in Afghanistan among their soldiers per capita than any of the NATO countries. They were with us in Iraq in 2003. Um, so if I'm a Danish politician, I'm like, I don't know what's happened to the country that I've done everything I can to be a good ally of, and they're turning around and doing this. The Danish prime minister said this would mean the end of NATO. Is that a bluff we're willing to call? Now, there's a lot of hubris coming out of the White House that maybe that is a bluff we're willing to call. They need us more than we need them, is the argument. What is clear, though, I mean, from the Danish perspective, is that there are U.S. intelligence operations right now in Greenland. Can you imagine that, by the way? You go to the finest colleges, you get a job at Langley, you become a case officer, you're trained in Virginia at Fort Camp Perry, and then your first assignment, lucky you, you're going to nuke. And you're like, what? What the hell is that? It's the capital of Greenland. Your job is to ascertain Greenlander public opinion on the annexation to the US and do whatever you can, whether it's money or intimidation or otherwise, to convince Greenlanders that their future lies with the United States. And according to a Reuters poll, whatever money we've been spending in Greenland apparently hasn't been spent well, because 80% of Greenlanders, all 54,000 of them, reject U.S. annexation. So, how did we go from being a guarantor of European security to being a top threat to European security in the space of 6 months, 12 months? For the sake of Greenland. I mean, no, this is not Monty Python. This is international politics. And again, to me, if you're to ask me, I am not convinced Greenland is worth an alliance that has paid dividends for us for decades. Yes, there are legitimate burden sharing arguments. The Europeans aren't holding their weight. Well, they're doing a lot better. And yeah, the president can pat himself on the back and say, that's because I pressured them to. But Pressuring them to spend more and then killing an alliance are two different things. The president made it very clear earlier this month in an interview with The Atlantic, we do need Greenland, absolutely. Okay, but I would ask this, is there an American consensus on this? Now, we have a president who's inclined to say, of course they do, and go on to the next topic. But I do think we need to dig deeper on this, maybe the subject of another discussion at a future time. The president's description of Canada as the 51st state, yeah, I guess is partly humor. It's kind of childish humor, in my opinion. I mean, it's like South Park, right? Canada, 51st state. It doesn't go down well with our neighbors north of the border. Lest we forget, we're talking about a parliamentary democracy since 1867, a U.S. ally in two world wars, a U.S. ally in NORAD, U.S. ally in NATO. Need I say more? And yet repeated White House jibes like 51st state frankly baffle, annoy, and alarm Canadians all at the same time. They don't know whether to take us seriously, but they also know at the same time that they can't afford not to take us seriously, especially when it's the US president saying this, and especially when he's saying it repeatedly. So in Canada, there's the notion of Greenland's first and then what, right? This is the hemisphere agenda. When a country that has been a sovereign parliament since 1867 calls on their head of state, who, by the way, is King Charles III, think about that for a sec, and said, we need a public statement from you reaffirming our sovereignty. I think that's when the Canadians are maybe taking this a little more seriously than their neighbors south of the border are. Let's recall that Canada has virtually no military means to repel an invasion. I am convinced that it would be easier to invade Canada than Greenland. Fort Drum in upstate New York is within 2 hours of the capital of Canada, Ottawa. Between Fort Drum and Ottawa is Kingston, home of the Royal Military Academy of Canada. A bunch of cadets ain't going to stop the 10th Mountain Division from marching on Ottawa. Or, for an alternative, I guess it didn't come up here, Vancouver, British Columbia is within 3 hours of Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington State. That's the other big city in Canada if you accept Montreal. All right. So implications for us. I would argue that Venezuela is a limited security benefit that could rapidly become a big liability. We have the same regime in Caracas. I don't think we've gained anything on the counter drug front. And I'm not sure we've really gained anything vis-a-vis Russia and China by exerting this kind of control over a Latin American country. Our actual leverage over Venezuela is unclear. I mean, it's fine and well to threaten from afar and bluster and to show that we could do it, right? We snatched Maduro so apparently easy and effortlessly. And yet it does raise some questions about an inside job, doesn't it? There, I raised that question. I have no answer for you. Congress was not notified in advance. And of course, for those of you who have been reading the press, this is a continuing expansion of presidential powers that precedes Donald Trump by some decades. In fact, goes back to my parents' and grandparents' time after World War II, and yet is a troubling sign when it's been accelerating with recent Supreme Court judgments. The War Powers Act has never been tested in court. Remember that. Passed after Vietnam. And it likely won't pass this Supreme Court if I'm reading the tea leaves right, given the majority opinion on presidential powers right now. Venezuela strains the president's coalition. So we'll go from back to politics for a minute. The America Firsters versus the interventionists, right? If boots are required on the ground, I think we all know that this could be a really serious political risk for the president, not just for his coalition, but for his ability to control Congress. It's a fact. The U.S. Congress has not passed a formal declaration of war since 8 December 1941. Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, lest we forget, the Congress shall have power to declare war. That's about it, though. A lot of room for lawyers to wiggle in. So, what kind of foreign policy do we have? A president who ran on a non intervention platform, and yet, look at all these operations, including threats now to get back involved in Iran, in the air. Pretty tepid congressional criticism. We have a Congress that's notorious for not taking its responsibilities on foreign policy seriously. I think that's a big error, and it's both parties. We have an American public that generally is not engaged and doesn't seem to care. But this is quite a list, isn't it? And you could say, well, but all of these have been successful. But we know from previous operations in Iran, be careful what you wish for over the long term. We're not afraid of boots on the ground, said the president when asked about Venezuela and its future. Trump is not, never was an isolationist. So I got news for the isolationist right. This is MAGA foreign policy. This is Mark Thiessen, Washington Post conservative commentator. This might be news to a lot of Trumpists out there. I'm sick of stupid, said the Republican senator from North Carolina. The amateurs who said it was a good idea should lose their jobs. Yeah, maybe a little bit of a warning from the Senate side. We'll see. The implication for the world order is, of course, where I'm ending up at. I think international law experts are probably a dime a dozen, and you may find any number of opinions, but there seems to be a pretty rough consensus that a snatch operation seizing the sovereign leader of one country, however illegal he was put in power, is questionable to illegal at best. Certainly a violation of a state sovereignty. Now, most Americans, I think we all know, probably some of you out there are doing this, right? So what? I mean, international law. Seriously, kid? But let's look at the broader trends, all right? You might shrug off international law, but the fact is that a world order that was created after World War II, which, by the way, with a lot of American, British blood, Canadian blood, is being dismantled in front of our eyes. We have U.S. policymakers in the White House talking about the worthlessness of alliances that were created and preserved over decades. And it's almost like they're not worth it anymore. And there's not really a debate about it. I mean, it's fine and well to say this, but is there a consensus? And according to opinion polls, there isn't. Americans still have the common sense to understand the value of NATO, for example. Rejecting the United Nations, it's worthless, it's a waste of money. Or the European Union. Comments in the most recent national security strategy describing Europe basically as a civilization that's destroying itself because of mass immigration. I mean, this stuff feeds into what, to my mind, is frankly a racist agenda that's describing Europe as being submerged by Africans, right? This primordial or whatever out there. And a lot of Europeans are looking around and going, I don't know what they're talking about. We, by the way, helped create the United Nations. Let's not forget this. We also promoted, and up until very recently, continued to promote further unification of the European continent, as in our best national security interests. And this apparently is being jettisoned. And by the way, Russia and China are more than happy to jump on board this agenda. This exactly fits theirs. A world where might makes right. So be careful what you wish for. This new world order, frankly, is very poorly defined by this administration. Might makes right is a great soundbite for a muscular foreign policy type, huh? Or as Donald Trump's advisor, Stephen Miller, said, these are iron laws since the beginning of time. And my rebuttal is, really? And is that good? And since these so-called iron laws produced 2 world wars, how good are they and how predictable are they and how do they keep us out of conflict? If we take Venezuela, take, whatever exactly that means, indefinite control of their oil industry? What is to stop Russia from turning around and doubling down or whatever on Ukraine, Estonia, Moldova, Poland? Don't think this isn't in Vladimir Putin's mindset. In fact, we know from congressional testimony of 2019 that Putin's foreign minister offered us an exchange. We'll give you Venezuela, you give us Ukraine. This was Fiona Hill's testimony. This is the way the Russian president thinks. And apparently it's the way we think, or maybe inclined to think. We'll see. We've witnessed what Putin's world order means in Ukraine. And for a while there, I was really debating putting up one of the massacre pictures in Ukraine. But I thought, I'm just, I think we all know the message. Then China takes Taiwan, South China Sea, maybe Japan while they're at it. Again, a might makes right world leads to a world done on spheres of influence. And sooner or later, those spheres of influence are going to collide. And when we start to turn to our allies who no longer exist and say, we would like some help, they ain't going to be there for us. And to me, that's the most frightening lesson that we learned from our own isolationist period leading up to World War II. Was we were damn lucky that the British were still afloat, weren't we, in 1941-42? Is this the kind of world that we really want? And that's where I'm going to leave it. But I'm going to open it up to questions, to comments, to objections. I raised a lot of stuff here, hopefully stirred the pot a little bit. We'll see what we get.
Well, thanks, Owen. We do have a few questions that were submitted in advance, and I'll start with one. Professor Sears, drawing on your work regarding intelligence services, covert action, and unconventional warfare in places like Egypt, Pakistan, and Iran, how should Americans honestly assess the U.S. operation that removed President Maduro, an action many governments and international lawyers are characterizing as an illegal abduction and violation of Venezuelan sovereignty? In your view, what are the most likely long-term consequences for U.S. security and credibility in Latin America if this becomes an accepted tool of policy? And what specific legal or oversight guardrails should citizens be pressing Congress to put in place immediately to prevent similar actions from normalizing a new era of great power impunity?
Wow, big question. My view is that the abduction of Maduro, this is my personal view, was a violation of international sovereignty. However effective it was tactically, I think strategically it may go down as a very questionable success at best and a catastrophe at worst. What are the worst potential consequences? Reaffirming all the cynics in Latin America who say that the leopard never changes its spots, right? It's the same United States that intervened a century ago, and despite good neighbor policy, Roosevelt, despite Alliance for Progress, Kennedy, even despite the Reagan period of promoting democracy, the United States has finally showed Latin America for what it is. They're after us for our resources. I don't know if we want to be regarded so cynically by our neighbors as that. The question about legality and guardrails. I think this is going to require a congressional consensus that doesn't exist. Obviously. We used to have a consensus on foreign policy. The disappointing thing is that it's gone. We have very tepid criticism from the Democrats, frankly. We have the Republicans who aren't sure what to do. They see the pitfalls in front of them, but they're also afraid of a president. Remember, it's the senator from Alaska who said she's afraid of the president and what he could do to her or her supporters. That's the dilemmas they face. In other words, they're not meeting their responsibilities. Guardrails, well, I think it's going to require a different Supreme Court than we have. If we did put War Powers Act to the test in the Supreme Court, I'm not so sure it would pass. And that's why I think one of the reasons why it's never been put to the test for different reasons, right? It could succeed. Oh, no, that would be good. It would constrain the president. Or it could fail. Oh, no, that will unleash the president. No one seems willing to stand up to what I think is the fundamental issue. of the use of U.S. military resources and who actually gets to authorize and legislate it. The Constitution seems quite clear, but the way we've allowed our country to be run for decades, mind you, this predates Donald Trump. The Congress has abdicated a lot of responsibility, and I don't think that's a good thing.
Okay, we have a couple of messages in the chat, and then
Mhm.
we'll go over to the Q&A box. Hi, would love to hear your assessment on how this may play into a U.S. gambit to secure oil independence from Saudi Gulf oil and the web of interests and obligations that come with them.
Okay, the question about whether this will guarantee us oil independence. Um, the person who's asking the question is probably well aware that we have been a net exporter of oil for several years now. And yes, it's thanks to a Republican backed initiative in several states called fracking. We'll give credit where credit's due if you think that's where credit should be due. We'll leave aside the environment for a moment. What it's meant has been expanded U.S. oil production. We still import oil, but we're a net exporter. It's how the business works. I don't know, and I don't think gaining Venezuelan oil, gaining whatever exactly that means, is going to be a real dividend for us for a long time. I mentioned how much it's going to take to recapitalize it, and it's the time factor. I don't think this president is going to be in the White House when the Venezuelan oil industry breaks even again. That's saying big things. Who knows what's going to happen in the oil industry next? But we all know that the demand for oil, there are different forces at work. Electrical vehicles puts the demand down in some cases. The growth of the Chinese and East Asian economies is sort of a counterforce. So it's kind of hard to say we'll all be out of the oil business in 10 years. But I don't think the U.S. can make a serious claim to energy independence by occupying another country's oil resources indefinitely. It's just not viable. I don't think the American public is going to sit still for it, let alone the public in Venezuela, let alone the Venezuelan elites for that matter. Sooner or later, the emperor is going to be shown to have no clothes, and that emperor is us. Are we really willing to shoot Venezuelans on the streets for the sake of controlling their oil resources? And I would argue that the vast majority of us would say, I'm kind of uncomfortable with that.
Another oil question.
Mhm.
Dan says, Matt Randolph doubts the claim of the Maduro regime that Venezuela has such large reserves. Nothing from the earlier years indicates massive reserves. He thinks there is no reason to accept the claim.
I would push back on that, only so much as saying if you go to BP World Energy, it's a report they put out every year, drawn on their own sources. And I would suspect that an oil company as respected as BP would not rely solely on Maduro regime sources for this, put Venezuela in first place for world reserves. Um, a lot of it is expensive to extract and refine. That cuts into its value. It's not like Saudi oil. I'm being a little facetious, within feet of the ground, right? And doesn't require as much refining. But remember that Venezuela also has offshore oil reserves in the Orinoco offshore basin. We know that considerable oil reserves were found off of Guyana, Suriname, and northern Brazil, which are now being exploited. I suspect that there's probably even more that isn't even counted towards Venezuela's share right now off the coast of Venezuela. So I don't find as much reason to be skeptical of the size of Venezuela's oil reserves, if only because it seems like a large number of people who are in the oil business, and I'm admittedly not, seem to accept them as valid.
I do want to encourage any more questions. Owen has been incredibly thorough in his presentation today, but we have about 8 more minutes. I'll go to Bill's question. Have the Caracas strongmen been involved in the drug smuggling or money laundering, as was Maduro?
According to the U.S. Justice Department and Treasury, yes. Both Cabello and Padrino Lopez have charges pending against them in the U.S. for involvement in narco trafficking. Your question does raise an interesting point, which I didn't make today. Remember, U.S. courts, they're not as predictable as maybe presidents and secretaries of state would like them to be. We've taken an awful risk here, haven't we? We have injected a foreign leader into our judicial system, and God knows where that trial is going to go. Um, a lot of evidence is going to have to come out. A lot of it is going to be based on what I suspect are classified sources. It's going to raise questions about, how do you collect your intel? Who are the sources for this? I'm just saying there may be a lot of unexpected turbulence coming from this trial of Maduro and his wife. But in answer to your question, yes, both the strongmen have been accused by the U.S. Of several charges related to so-called narco terrorism.
So we have some questions on what your crystal ball has to tell us in 5 to 10 years. What could potentially be happening down the road in Venezuela, Greenland, Ukraine, China, Iran, all the trouble spots?
Wow. Okay, let's deal with Greenland first. I think the president is serious about this. Um, this isn't Monty Python, unfortunately. Um, you know, the Secretary of State has said to Congress that this is essentially a strong arm measure on the part of the president. What's Denmark's price? It's getting harder for Denmark to even name a price when the leader of Greenland, um, it's an autonomous region within Denmark, has come out, I guess, yesterday and said, we're not interested in any sort of association with the United States that involves annexation. So Denmark's wiggle room is rather limited. What I'm suggesting here is that we have a president, who supposedly can't run for a third term, who's probably going to be hell bent for leather to establish what he considers to be his legacy. And I think Denmark is there. Now, are we calling Europe's bluff on this? Personally, I think we can take Denmark militarily, and whatever egg is beyond our face, and however furious our European allies will be, I don't think this will be the thing that kills NATO in the end, to be honest, to be fair. Will it put a lot of strains? Absolutely. Will it lead Denmark to leaving NATO? Probably not. And the main reason, frankly, is what Russia's doing in Ukraine. All the NATO countries, well, especially the Eastern ones, are looking at that and going, we don't want that. We don't want it anywhere near us. So we'll just have to hold our nose in dealing with the Americans and what we regard as their crazy administration and hopefully get through this. When the Secretary General of NATO calls Trump daddy, the Europeans are doing all they can to try and appease the American president. As far as China goes, I think China's going to blink on this one. I'm not sure they're going to just pocket the $10 billion loss indefinitely. I think they'll keep it in the back reserve. What I do think, though, is that if and when China does go after Taiwan, people are saying next year, right? That, it's just another another arrow in their quiver. If we criticize the operation, they're going to say, hey, you can go and take the Venezuelan president. All we're doing is reestablishing control over a breakaway region. As for Russia and Ukraine, frankly, I think the Russians are at the very end of their resources in Ukraine. They're rebuilding their military, but remember, by doing that, they're diverting resources away from other more productive parts of their economy. So 5 to 10 years from now, I see China on the same trajectory, frankly. I see China in control of Taiwan by hook or crook. Um, I see us having yielded considerable strategic ground in the Western Pacific. Um, I will see us facing a more, if anything, more cynical Latin America, but by the same token, also Latin America that's willing to say, we've seen this behavior from the Americans before. Who knows who'll be in the White House then. But maybe we can move past this. So a little bit of negativity and a little bit of if cynicism can pass for optimism these days. I guess that's a comment on our times, but maybe that's the best answer.
You mentioned the Cubans that had been killed in Venezuela. Uh, what do you think all the Cubans in Venezuela during the event was about?
Well, we know for a fact, from multiple sources, that Cuban intelligence played a major role in ensuring the Chavez Maduro regime's hold on power. Cuban intelligence trained SEBIN, which is the Venezuelan intelligence service. We know this from two defectors who happened to be leaders of SEBIN. Nothing like defectors from who were heads of the intel service. We know that some of Maduro's bodyguards were Cubans. He didn't even trust his own people. But the Cubans have a major stake in Venezuela. Don't get me wrong. They have an economic stake here as well as a political one. If you go back to Fidel Castro as early as the early 1960s, for him, Venezuela was the target because of the oil, because of the prestige. One of Cuba's first attempts at exporting insurgency was to Venezuela in 1964. So when Chavez came to power and made it very clear that Castro was his model, his idol, for Castro this was a dream come true. Too bad it happened so late, right? I mean, Castro was already getting pretty sick. But for a lot of Cubans, Venezuela was like a shot in the arm, literally, because one thing that Chavez did was he hived off a certain percentage of his oil every year for Cuba's exclusive use. And the Cuban regime turned around and sold that oil on the international market, and God knows where the profits went. But they definitely have an interest in the survival of this regime, which again puts the Secretary of State in an awkward position, right? We are more or less backstopping a regime along with the Cubans, the same regime, at least right now. I'm scratching my head over that one.
Well, Owen, as one of our viewers noted, this has been an exceptional talk. Another question was expressing concern about what we as citizens can do if we have concerns about such actions. And I just want to take it back to Mike Mansfield. In 1970, the public's negative reaction to the Cambodian campaign, our invasion of Cambodia, played a crucial role in convincing Congress to adopt a more active stance in ending America's military involvement in Vietnam. And as Senate Majority Leader, Mike Mansfield was one of several senators most closely identified with the fight to end the war through legislation. Initially, he was a strong believer in the primacy of the executive branch in foreign policy, but he came to question and eventually sought to limit the president's power to wage war without the consent of Congress. And it was the opposition of Mansfield's constituents to the expansion of the war that precipitated his own decision to oppose the war more actively through legislation, thus leading him to sponsor the War Powers Act that Owen mentioned earlier. So I would reinforce that the Mansfield Center is a nonpartisan center here to serve the people of Montana and the country. Encourage you all to be actively involved, empowered citizens, and participating in Mansfield conversations like this is a great way to be involved. This morning I was on KGVO Talkback on 1290 AM with Professor Stephen Vladeck of Georgetown University, talking about some of these same issues. He will be in a Mansfield dialogue on February 10th. Our next conversation is actually an unveiling of a Mansfield mural by local artist Hadley Ferguson that's here at the Mansfield Center on January 23rd at 4 o'clock. And we'll be announcing more events through our email list. So if you're not on the email list, please join us by emailing mansfieldcenter.org. And Owen, thank you again so much for an incredible conversation. And thanks to all of you for being part of it. Good
Thank you.
afternoon.